Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
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 Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, translation and commentary by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhakti Vedanta Swami. Adi Lila chapter 17, verse 10. Yeah, please go ahead. Okay. We are warned against committing Vaishnava aparadha, offences to devotees. That will bring upon us severe sinful reactions, and worse still, that will stop the growth of our devotional creeper. It will destroy our chances of becoming Krishna conscious. Not completely, because the very nature of the jiva is to be Krishna conscious, but it will severely impede our devotional advancement, maybe for many, many lifetimes. Hearing this, we should become very afraid and endeavor not to commit offences to Vaishnavas. We should also want to know what constitutes an offence. In the Bhakti Sandarbha of Jiva Goswami, in his 265th Anuched, Anucheds means that small chapters. In the course of explaining the 10 offences against the holy name, Srila Jiva Goswami cites from the Skanda Purana in a description of various kinds of offences against Vaishnavas. Actually, the word used, as you know, satam nindanamna, it's saintly persons, to blaspheme saintly persons. Saintly persons can include non-Vaishnavas. From one perspective, saintly persons can include non-Vaishnavas. But the Gauriya Vaishnava Acharyas explain this term in this context to mean Vaishnavas. In Bengali, or it's partly Sanskrit, but in Bengali it's always rendered, the term is rendered as sadhu ninda, or ninda of sadhus. The word ninda is translated as blasphemy, or as deleterious, adverse criticism. Now, in English, there's a gap, there's a big space, a big difference between adverse criticism can be quite mild, and blasphemy is very severe, but the same term is used in Sanskrit. So, from this verse of Skanda Purana, as cited by Jiva Goswami, we can understand what constitutes offences, or particularly what constitutes criticism of Vaishnavas. Skanda Purana warns that those fools who commit offences to Vaishnavas, who are all great souls, they fall into the hell known as Maharorava. Not only do they fall, but they cause all their ancestors to fall. The 6 offences to a Vaishnava are: number 1, killing a Vaishnava, verbal blasphemy.
Second.
Yeah, number 2, verbal blasphemy. Number 3, being envious of, maintaining an attitude of dislike. These are all acts of commission or actively performed facets of offense. One is, the number 4 is a sin, these are all sins of commission, and number 4 is a sin of omission, of failing to do something, not glorifying Him. Number 6 is also a sin of omission, not being happy upon seeing Him. And number 5 is also a sin of commission, being angry at Him. And Jiva Goswami adds to this that it's also offensive to witness someone else doing these activities and not take exception to that. The 5th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam describes the hell known as Maharaurava. Evam eva Maharauravo yatra nipatitang purushang kravyada nama rauravastang kravyena ghatayanti yah kevalam deham bharaha. A person who is another kind of person who goes to Maharaurava is a person who just spends his life nourishing his body without or maintaining his body without any spiritual dimension to his life. In that hell, animals called rurus, which are very fierce animals not seen on this planet, they rip to shreds the body of that sinful person and devour his flesh. You may think, oh, well, it sounds pretty bad, but it's just a one-time thing, then it's over. But it's not so easy, because the body will again form and again be ripped to pieces, again and again. That's pretty frightening. So let's look at these 6 points in a little more detail. To kill, although it's not specifically, killing is the number one stated. Although other acts of physical violence are not mentioned, they can be understood to be included in this category. To physically strike a Vaishnava is to, or to in other ways inflict physical suffering, is a kind of offense. To blaspheme, then all kinds of verbal attacks on a Vaishnava. To call him nasty names, to speak nastily to him or about him, or speaking lies and spreading gossip about him. Number 3, to maintain an envious attitude toward a Vaishnava, to have ill feeling toward him, to hope for bad things to happen to him, to be happy when unfortunate things happen to him, to be sad when good things happen to him. This is low level of consciousness, which a Vaishnava should not maintain toward anyone in general, although of course the devotees were very glad when Ravana was killed, for instance. So this is a mental offense to maintain an attitude of malice and hatred toward a Vaishnava. To fail to glorify a Vaishnava is also offensive. Someone who has dedicated his life to the service of Krishna is certainly glorious and should be glorified. But to fail to do so is a symptom of enviousness within the heart. If there's a manifest good quality of a Vaishnava and we fail to recognize that, no, it's not good, then that is also offensive. Now, this doesn't mean artificial glorification. It's not glorification to call a neophyte devotee a Paramahamsa. It's just plain wrong, that's all. Prithu Maharaj, we find in the narration of Prithu Maharaj in the Bhagavatam, that when he was praised, he said that, well, I haven't done anything to be praised yet, so it's a kind of insult to praise someone for things for qualities that he doesn't have. For instance, if a devotee is known to have perennially weak sadhana, and we glorify him, oh, he's so great in sadhana, so strict, it's an embarrassment for him. Bhakti Thakur sings, Shakadesham man karite shakati dehonatha jatha jatha. He prays to the Guru, you please give me the power to glorify everyone according to their level, appropriately. Jata Yoga, Jatochit, these are all synonyms. So we should glorify Vaishnavas, but realistically also. Anyone who chants Hare Krishna is glorious. One who upon being seen reminds one of Krishna is more glorious, and one by whose influence the whole world chants Hare Krishna is most glorious. To be angry at a Vaishnava is also offensive. Anger is very dangerous, especially when directed against Vaishnavas. Then to not be happy upon seeing a Vaishnava, that's similar to not glorifying a Vaishnava. And that arises from the already mentioned offense of maintaining bad feelings toward Vaishnavas. Well, how do we practically apply all of this? How do we practically apply this, especially in consideration that we're also supposed to exercise our intelligence to choose our association? If everyone is to avoid all these kinds of activities in toto, then there can be no proper delineation of Siddhanta, proper conclusions. From the activities of Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, we find that he was very critical of persons who chanted the names of Krishna, but who misbehaved, who performed very sinful activities, or who invented some kind of philosophy or practice. He was accused of being offensive against Vaishnavas. He actually shocked the Vaishnava community of the day by his strong attack on so many discrepancies among so-called Vaishnavas. So it's a very fine line we have to tread. We should not blaspheme Vaishnava or offend them in any way. On the other hand, we shouldn't be victimized by wrong ideas and practices that certain persons who are known as Vaishnavas may profess. And we should warn others if we perceive that someone who is a Vaishnava is misleading them. It might be perceived as an offense to point out that someone who is respected as a Vaishnava is actually introducing Mayavad and Sahaja practices within the Krishna consciousness movement. But it could be seen as a greater offense to fail to check their acts or their misleading acts. It is an offense to the previous acharyas to allow someone to misrepresent them. An example that pretty much everyone can agree with is that if it is discerned that someone who is known as a Vaishnava is engaged in child abuse, we should certainly point that out and stop that and punish the concerned person. Child abuse is very gross and thus easy to identify. The introduction of wrong practices or wrong ideas into the Sampradaya tend to be more subtle and thus difficult to identify. So you may think, well, just leave it. Why create a disturbance? Why make offenses? But that again creates a very dangerous situation. If the diseases of Mayavad and Sahajarism are allowed to grow within the Krishna conscious movement like a cancer. We really have to be very attentive and thoughtful in our practices of Krishna consciousness, especially as there's so much controversy in our present Krishna conscious movement. We should be very careful not to be offensive. If we take the position and say, I'm best, they're all nonsense, then that arrogance disqualifies us from being Vaishnava. On the other hand, we shouldn't be misled by wrong ideas. So it's really a time to go very deeply into the study of Shastra, which for us primarily means Srila Prabhupada's books, and seek out good association and guidance. We should not naively think that, well, everyone who's within ISKCON must be good association. On the other hand, we shouldn't become inimical to anyone who's chanting the holy names. But even those who are chanting the holy names, you may become inimical to them if they're doing in a manner which is grossly against the Vaishnava Siddhanta. or if they themselves are envious of our sampradaya and our acharya. So Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he was very strongly against various groups of Babajis and his Nitai Gaur Radhesham people for introducing disturbances into the pure and holy Vaishnava practices. Shruti, Smriti, Purana, Adi, Pancharatra, Vidindina, Vaikantiki Hare Bhakti, Utpataya Eva Kalpata. This word Utpat means disturbance. The verse means that anyone who tries to introduce practices into the path of pure, one-pointed devotional service, practices that are not in line with Shastra, and they simply bring disturbances into Vaishnava society. If we examine the history of Gauriya Vaishnavism, or the history of religion in general, or just history, the history of the world, we find that there are various different approaches and attitudes and philosophies. Among Gauriya Vaishnavas, there are distinguishes for Gauriya Vaishnavas by a certain philosophy and understanding. But among them, among Gauriya Vaishnavas who have the same basic understanding, there may be some very deep doctrinal differences. So within our ISKCON also, which is a subset of the Gauriya Vaishnava Sampradaya, inevitably there are differences. That doesn't mean we should create enmity with or envy other members of ISKCON. But it also doesn't mean that we should just go along with whatever anyone says, nor necessarily accept what someone says because they are a respected leader. Everything should be understood in terms of Guru, Sadhu and Shastra. If someone is deviating from the path of Guru, Sadhu and Shastra, even though they may be a very big leader, still it's deviation. One should understand, if it is deviation, one should understand how it is deviation. How can we understand? According to Guru, Sadhu and Shastra. So we must be very, very careful not to do any kinds of offenses to Vaishnava. And we must also be very, very careful to follow sadhu maraganugamanam, to follow the path given by the previous acharyas. So these two considerations in practical life, they might seem to be working against each other. But somehow we have to keep the balance between the two. In this regard, I may quote words of Lord Jesus Christ, which Srila Prabhupada often used to quote also. Sometimes used to quote. Hate the sin and not the sinner. So we should be aware if something is wrong and reject that, but we shouldn't retain any personal malice against those who are propagating that which is not correct. Of course, to ascertain what is actually correct can be a very exacting process also, which required to properly understand all these things. One requires very deep knowledge of Srila Prabhupada's books, broader Shastra, the whole Vaishnava tradition, and quite likely also the various circumstances in which various devotees are practicing and preaching Krishna consciousness. For instance, in certain circumstances, things may be done which would not be done in other circumstances. Even the very fact that we're discussing in these languages, English, Russian, in previous times that would be rejected.
The languages or discussion?
Yeah, the very languages. There was a time in India when it was considered that it was blasphemy to discuss religious topics in a language other than Sanskrit. So, but if we were not to, if it was limited to, if discussion of these topics was limited to Sanskrit also, then Krishna consciousness could have never come to the whole world. So that's just one example of how, according to various circumstances, what might be considered wrong in one set of time, place and circumstances may be considered right. Yes, it should be done, it must be done in another set of time, place, and so on. Then again, we shouldn't make the mistake of invoking the principle of time, place, and circumstance to introduce all kinds of speculations. The whole, if we consider all these points, it may seem quite confusing and too complicated for us to navigate. Our sincerity will be our best companion in this regard, and keeping the association of sincerity. In considering Vaishnava aparadha, we have to consider what actually constitutes aparadha. We also have to consider who is a Vaishnava. That was the name of a poem by Bhakti. He was accused of performing Vaishnava aparadha by criticizing so strongly so many deviants. One of his responses was to pen a poem called Who is a Vaishnava? A very broad definition of one is one who chants the holy name only once. And what is that? Jahamukhe hoi Krishname va Chaitanya Vaishnav Shrishta Shabaka. And Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was asked, who is a Vaishnava? Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's first reply was, who even chants the name of Krishna once is a Vaishnava and is best among all people.
And who asked Prabhupada?
No, this was, who was that? So it was Satyaraj Khan, I believe. Jarmukhe Aishe Krishna, Eva. So yeah, very fine consideration. Don't make offenses. But also don't make offenses by partaking in others' offenses. So it's a very good time for everyone to make a deep study of Shastra and understand all these points very clearly. And our own sincerity will be a good friend. Sincerity means to accept the purport of pure devotional service. Anyabhilashita shunyam jnana kamadyanavritam anukulena krishnanushilanam bhakti ruttama. Topmost devotion is that which is cultivated in a manner favorable for in a manner that Krishna likes, favorable for making advancement, and without cultivation of a spirit of enjoying this world or being released from it. In other words, everything for Krishna's pleasure only. Krishna te kila cheshta. All our endeavors should simply be for the sake of Krishna. Hare Krishna. I'll finish. If there are any questions about this?
If Vaishnava introduces Sahajiya into society of devotees, is he a Vaishnava? Can he be considered a Vaishnava?
Did anyone hear the question?
Well,
yeah, it can be a very subtle measurement or consideration. Someone who comes newly is almost certainly going to be influenced by these contaminations. But then someone who is mature and who takes the position of a teacher and introduces Mayabad and Sahaji, that may be, that's very dangerous. But we may misunderstand also. Someone who is very exuberant in their dancing and their singing, it doesn't necessarily mean they're a Sahajiya. If a Vaishnava is very withdrawn by nature and doesn't interact with others much, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's a Mayavadi. So we should be careful not to wrongly label devotees as Mayavadis or Sahajiyas. We should also be very cautious not to allow actual infiltrations of Mayavad and Sahajiya Bhav into our movement.
Maybe we should understand that Sahajiyas are those...
No, he's giving the purport.
Maybe we should mention that Sahajiyas are those devotees who strive for Bhakti, and Mayavadis are those who strive for Mukti. So in this case we can avoid using these labels, very strong labels, and we just can explain that those are motivated devotees. The first category wants to get material enjoyment, and the second category wants to get liberation.
Maybe. You don't use the strong word Mayavad or Sahaja, but you use instead motivated devotee. So it's choose your expletives. There's another question.
If a devotee committed offenses in his previous lives or previously Vaishnava apparatus, so how can he get rid of the reactions? How can he neutralize the reactions now?
Did you make offenses in previous life?
Before this lecture, not in your previous life, but
I see.
Before devotional service.
Before devotional service. Well, to even take to devotional service, one requires the mercy of the Vaishnava. So if one has committed offenses to Vaishnavas without being forgiven by them, one cannot even enter devotional service. So if one knows that one has made some offenses, one should approach the Vaishnavas and beg for their mercy and forgiveness. Examples are given in Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita of Gopal Chapal, who offended Sridhar Thakur and had to beg for his forgiveness, of Jagai and Madhai, who had to beg forgiveness. Madhai begged forgiveness from Nityananda Prabhu for the offense to him. And after coming to devotional service, Madhai spent his whole life serving the Vaishnavas in a very humble and repentant mood. In the early stages of devotional service, it's almost inevitable we're going to do things wrongly. That can be overlooked, just like the behavior of a child is overlooked. It's understood. The child doesn't know how to behave. But if one is habitually arrogant in his behavior with Vaishnavas, then you can't really enter into devotional service at all. I have a situation of a person wanting to take initiation from me. So that person fulfills all the basic requirements, 16 rounds, 4 regulated principles. But the attitude of that person is habitually arrogant. So I'm not at all inclined to give initiation, because it's not that with that attitude you'll simply make offenses and you can't make any progress. There has to be a change of heart. You may need a little more explanation for those who don't understand the Sanskrit terms.
Да, ну,
Yes.
Oh, you want to do something?
In the 11th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, the definition of Madhyamadikari is given, and it is mentioned that he is Madhya Upeksha, Kripa Upeksha. So it means that he ignores
He's merciful to the innocent,
yeah,
and ignores the envious. So?
The question is,
what
yes, what does it mean? Yes, to ignore.
Yeah. Kripa means to be merciful to. That is in relation to the Balishesha, the innocent, and Upeksha is for the envious. Neglecting is there. Citing this verse, Srila Prabhupada writes in one purport that one should not respect as an envious person who is in the dress of a Vaishnava, but should completely reject him.
Srila Prabhupada in his purport?
In one purport, in the Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, states that one should not respect an envious person, a so-called Vaishnava, someone in the dress of a Vaishnava who's actually envious, but should completely neglect him. Mm-hmm. In one purport, in Srila Prabhupada writes, there are many envious persons in the dress of Vaishnavas. So you may get one group of devotees saying, oh, they're the ones who are envious. And that group will say, no, you're the ones who are envious. Therefore, Siddhanta Balaya Chitte Nakaraha Alash Yahapite Krishna Lage Sujana. One should not be lazy in understanding the conclusions of scriptures, for by such discussions one's mind becomes strongly attached to Krishna.
Lord Chaitanya said that the Vaishnava is one who chanted the holy name of Krishna. But what chanting is understood? What level of chanting? Namaparada, Namabhas, Shrutanam.
Repeat the question. Well, it depends how literally you want to interpret this, literally or otherwise. Namaparada cannot really be considered as chanting of the holy names at all. From Prema Vivarta, we have the understanding. Ashadu Sangye Bhai Krishna Nai Hoi Nam Akha Bahiri Bhate Tabu Nam Kabu Noi. That unless one is chanting in the association of and under the guidance of properly situated devotees, I'm giving an extrapolated translation here, then one's chanting of Krishna's name is not really Krishna's name at all. Even though the syllables of the holy name may manifest, that's not the name of Krishna. Yeah, then? There's a question? Wait a minute, you already...
Can a junior devotee argue with a senior devotee? What is the proper etiquette in this case?
Can you repeat it? Oh, I see, sorry. Don't criticize me. What was that? Gurus? They rip you to shreds? Yeah, can do, but the etiquette should be considered also. Generally, if a junior has some contention, he may try to, or he may ask another senior devotee on the same level of the one he has a contention with to take up the issue on his behalf. There is a way of making one's point indirectly, by making questions. By questions or by other means. Directly and indirectly at the same time. For instance, if a leader contends that, well, I don't need to go to Mongol Arati because I'm senior. And you say, then the jury may say, oh, is that really so? Did Srila Prabhupada teach that? He may submit politely in this way. Alright, a written question, and I think we may finish this devotees.
Is it true that you will teach in Bhakti, you will teach Bhakti Shastras in Mayapur during Kartika? I'm sorry for my boldness. Please give information.
Oh, that Balarama Acharya wanted me to announce. It's a little bit true.
It's a little bit true?
Yeah, I'll be there for a few days. And it's a cameo appearance.
Cameo?
Cameo appearance means when the director of a film plays in the film, but he just comes on for like 3 seconds or something like that. Or he just comes in and puts a cup on the table and walks out. It's brief. We hope it'll be short but substantial. The subject I'm taking up is very substantial and probably more enlivening than all this talk about offences and controversies and all this kind. We've really had a heavy dose this time during this festival. I don't usually talk about all these things, but you set me up with all your questions. And also, it seems that the situation in ISKCON Russia at the present time necessitates that there being so many questions in the air. Anyway, whatever happens, go on chanting Hare Krishna. Krishna will always has been, and always will be the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Our constitutional position always has been and always will be His eternal servant. So whatever may or may not happen in the big wide world or in the little world of ISKCON, go on chanting Hare. And many thanks again to all the devotees who have participated in this festival, and hope to see you all again next year. Hare Krishna.